Hi everyone, this is Kristen. In today's video, I am going to show you how I painted this watercolor desert scene. I painted it in a very loose and quick style, taking only about 30 minutes, but I have simplified the process and broken it down so that you can totally paint this one too. For this project, I am using Saunders Waterford paper, 140-pound cold press on a block, and I am also using my Daler-Rowney Aquafine 48-pan studio watercolor set. Now, you know I love using limited palette of colors, but sometimes I love using convenience colors, especially when I'm painting with lots of browns, reds, and oranges. It's just so nice to have a wide variety of colors with the 48-pan set. And if you have seen any of my past videos, you know that I already have a Daler-Rowney Aquafine 48-pan set that is very well loved, so I'm excited to get a fresh set and break this in for you while we paint this beautiful landscape. Now, I would typically use the paper on a block, but I wanted a slightly smaller piece of paper, so I cut it off the block and taped it to my desk. And the brushes I will be using today are the Princeton Neptune 3/4 wash brush and the Princeton Aqua Elite round size 10 and round long size 4. We're going to start with the 3/4 wash brush. I'm doing just clean water in a really rough and loose way. Some of the paper is not getting wet on the edges, and I don't want too much water, but I just want everything to be able to flow once I start putting the paint colors down. For the sky, I wanted to keep it really simple, a few swipes of turquoise, leaving some of the white of the paper for the idea of clouds. Then I rinsed my brush and mixed together light red and yellow ochre to give me a perfect base color for the red rocks in the background. I'm still using my 3/4 wash brush because it's going to help me get some really loose geometric shapes in the background here. And remember that the first layers are really to block in the colors and the shapes. We can be really loose. This is going to be our light values once it has dried. But while it's still wet, we are going to mix together some raw sienna and light red to start tapping in some of the shadowy colors. I like to keep everything light in this stage, but having a nice blended dimension shadowy color within this stage is also really nice. But we need to move on from the red rocks at this point so that we can get some of the blended greenery around the rocks as well. Now I'm picking up some light cad yellow, mixing it with blues I already had on my palette, but a cerulean would work great for this. We're really just trying to create a bright, light, vibrant green because everything at the top here I want to stay really light and warm so that it feels like maybe the sun is hitting the top of this foliage. Now, while everything is still wet, I am picking up sap green and tapping it into some areas in the greenery because we do want to create depth, but we don't want to lose the lightness at the top of our green areas. Also, I did tap in some green on the red rocks to represent some foliage that is up there as well. But you can see I'm moving really fast because I want everything to feel connected to a point. The sky, the rocks in the background, the greenery is touching the rocks, and then now we're painting kind of a dirt path, and I want all of that to feel connected. So I need to move really quickly so that one section isn't drying before I can get the connected, blended feel from each area. For those colors in the middle, for the path, I used yellow ochre and raw sienna really roughly together so that I could get a combination of the dirt feel but also keep a lot of the warmth with the yellow ochre. And I tapped in a few areas of the sap green while the trees were still wet as well. Now I want my light source coming from the right side, so I am going to focus a lot of my shadows in the rocks and in the trees on the left side of the painting. But across this path, I also wanted to create a really reddish brown color to represent some shadows that the trees and the foliage is casting across the path. So I used the light red as a base for those shadow colors so that we had a lot of warmth, and then I tapped in an indigo mixture on the top. Using that same color combo while the red rocks are still wet, I tapped in a few shadowy areas up there as well. Again, keeping all of my shadows to the left, I'm able to start building up what the structure looks like in the rocks as everything on the right side becomes lighter and has less color. I love using my flat wash brush for this because my strokes are a lot more loose and geometric, which is perfect for this subject. And if we move quick enough, we can get a lot of really nice blends before we move on to the detail layers. Now, we don't have to finalize everything in this bottom layer, but as long as the paper is still wet, there's a lot of wiggle room that we have. So I am using some of this light brown color that we have mixed using the light reds, the raw sienna, the yellow ochre. Those three are kind of my go-to for this color combination. I'm fixing up the left side of the path, making sure there's enough color there. And then I can go in with some brighter red. This is vermilion, but I did mix it into some blues and greens that were already on my palette, giving it this really deep rusty color. And it's perfect to continue to use my wash brush, continue to start creating those shapes and lines in the red rocks, really forming where everything is going to be while the paper is still wet. You can see those nice watercolor blends. At this point, my paper is damp, and so adding these details while everything is damp, but you can still see some of the harshness of the lines, is perfect. Now we are completely switching gears. Our paper is totally dry and we have switched to the size 10 round brush. This means we are going to start focusing more on details and precise shapes that are not as big and blocky, and now we have a little bit more breathing room. We don't need to work as fast because we're not trying to keep the paper wet. So here I have a combination of Indian yellow and vermilion, and what I'm trying to do is actually negatively paint around the lightest areas of my tree line. So I really want to make sure that I have this rough, leafy texture in the tree line, so I am painting this deeper reddish orange color on the mountains around the trees. So it looks like a really rough, weird edge, but if you think about the trees that are appearing, that's the goal. So I'm using this color to block in those shapes, but because it is such a hard line, sometimes I will pick up water and smooth it out and create some texture that's going kind of side swiping to the right so we can get some of the lines in the red rocks. But really my goal with this color right now that I'm adding is to make the light tree areas appear. So an easy way to think about it is you're using your paint to help one section emerge, and that section is the leafy tops of the trees. I want them to emerge. I want to keep them light, and so I want to establish those sections first, but I don't want necessarily a very stark, hard outline of paint where the red rocks are. So then I use paint and water to blend the color and create texture and shapes into the red rocks so that I can have the shapes of the trees and that leafy texture, but I can also start building up the color and the texture in the rocks and the shapes next to it. So it does two purposes. While I have this deeper reddish orange color that I have been working with, I did mix some indigo into that color to get some of that darker shadow color you can see on the right side, because the vermilion leans very orange and the indigo leans very blue. They cancel each other out, but in a very warm way, and it gives really nice looking natural shadows. Now we're going to let the rocks dry while we focus on the greenery. Now I have a few goals with the greenery. I need to keep some of the light areas. I need to bring in warmth using yellow colors. And I also need to start establishing shadows, all while painting strokes that create leafy texture. So I am bouncing between sap green and olive green and yellow ochre, really randomly placing this leafy texture, using the tip of my brush to guide my strokes, And I'm trying to place it in bunches so that I can kind of step back and see where another bunch needs to be placed so that I can remember to maintain some of that lighter leafy color that we have already established in the first layer in the back. In the darker, more shadowy areas, I am mixing vermilion in with my green to get a nice deep green. Also indigo to make the shadows feel more cool. And then on the reverse, when I want to go lighter and bring some of the bright warmth in, I need to rinse my brush and pick up more cad yellow, lemon yellow brightness so that it feels like the sun is hitting the leaf and there's a little bit more warmth. Remember that value is the lightness or darkness of a color, and with watercolor we create a difference in value by either adding water or picking up more paint. So if I want something to be a lot lighter but still maybe a deeper blue color, I can just add more water to that mixture. If I want something to be very green, but more of a darker value, I can just pick up that green color like the olive green or sap green straight from the palette and also use that to help create depth and shadow without bringing in too much blue yet. For the branches, I'm using a mixture of indigo, vermilion, and cad red, using just the tip of my brush to sweep these branches and trunks in, keeping everything very loose and making sure to leave gaps so that the trunks and branches are not all connected so that the leaves look like they are in front of the branches as well. Sometimes when you're painting desert landscapes, it can be really easy to only think about browns, maybe some deep reds, but remember that you can add lots of yellows, oranges, greens into these desert landscapes because the desert is actually really colorful. So I'm trying to make sure to add yellow ochre in a lot of other places so that it brings in the warmth and the brightness that I see in the desert. So here I'm playing around with adding yellow ochre, light red, some vermilion, trying to get some more color by the path. And with that color that was already on my brush, I tapped my brush with my larger wash brush to get some splatter texture. I want to start building up that sandy, gritty, rocky feel, especially on this lower left where there isn't any of the contrast from the shadow that we've kind of got going on the right side of the path. I mixed together indigo and cad orange to get a really nice deep dusty brown color, and I am using that color to really find the edge of where the foliage meets the path. And so I'm creating those lines, letting it be really stark so that the brightness of where that foliage is meeting the path is really sharp, and then feathering out that shadow color into the shadows that we already have on the path. One of the ways to make paths look more realistic is by using the right perspective in the landscapes. So you can see that toward the bottom of my landscape, everything has opened up really, really wide, giving us the right perspective that we are standing here and the path is wide and it's open right in front of us. But as we get farther back toward the smaller greenery that are at the base of the rock, we need the path to almost disappear. So we're not opening it up as much, and we're keeping a lot of the colors darker and muddled back there as well. And then I use that same deep indigo color mixed with the cad orange to start adding more of that darker detail right under those lines along the path, just to crisp up that shadow and depth, especially as everything started to dry. And then I was able to bring that color up into the trees to create more contrast, more depth within our tree branches and tree trunks. We can start making those tree trunks and tree branches darker so that we have a lot of contrast and they stand out amongst the greenery. Now, I really like all of the layers that I have in my greenery at this point, but we really need that super deep contrasting color to finish it off. I like to mix cad orange with my indigo because they are complementary colors. They mute each other. They give a really deep, dusty color that's not black. It's got a lot of color still in it, but it gives us the contrast that we need. A little bit goes a long way. We're focusing it on the deepest, most inner parts of these trees so that it looks like shadow and we have a lot of depth. making some of the strokes really big so that we have a bigger area of shadow. And then as we get into some of these smaller areas or areas toward the top of the tree, we can add tiny strokes of shadow, but we don't want to overtake all of the layers of light, medium, and semi-dark that we have already built up in our greenery up to this point. And this is why you can see that the light areas that we built up in the beginning for that first layer are so important, because we cannot bring our light areas back. We need to build around them and make them pop using layers and contrast. Adding yellow ochre, cad orange, and some indigo together, I was able to get a really deep brown color, and I splattered that on the lower left as well. We already had a medium wash that was splattered, and so another wash in this darker color just really adds to the overall texture and the sandy feeling, especially when it's focused on that left side. Now we have our foliage and our foreground at a really great place. We're going to let it sit and finish up the details on our red rocks. This wash is cad orange with a slight bit of indigo in it, again to give it that dusty brownish orange feeling. We don't want any vibrant neon colors, so using colors across from each other on the color wheel can mute them and make them look more realistic. Because of our light source coming from the right side, we are focusing this color on the left side so that we can build up the color and depth as the shadows would be formed more on the left, especially if we're thinking about how textured and uneven and divoted these red rocks are. There's going to be points in the rocks that are more forward facing, that are catching the light, and then everything to the left of that can have a little bit more shadow to give the impression that some of these rocky areas are pushed a little bit more forward and catching the light. So to really start catching that illusion of light and shadow, this is where our lines do need to be harsh. We need a harsh, stark line between the shadow and the light area, and we can start creating textures in between. And it's easy to just focus on brown for these red rocks or the dusty oranges, but don't forget to pick up vermilion and cad orange and paint some very red areas. That's why they're called red rocks. But if you layer them over the top of these more muted brown colors, then the reds and the bright oranges will look a lot more natural. Keep them in a few places, don't overdo it, but remember you can swipe and glaze these beautiful colors right over the top. Even here, I'm using a light wash of Indian yellow to give the lighter areas that are catching the sunlight more warmth and color so they don't sit flat, but they still look lighter and have a lot of contrast compared to the shadow areas. Mixing in the cad orange back with my indigo color, I get that dusty blue shadow, and I can start creating lines and divots to not only negatively paint the light areas that are jutting out from the rocks, but also to start creating texture and interest in the shadow areas as well. Remember that watercolor is a layering medium. It is not going to look good in these beginning stages, and so you're going to wonder why it's not dark enough or it's not detailed enough. Trust the process and build up those layers that are more medium or soft. And then once you see the areas where you need the punchier contrast, as you get closer and closer to the end and you can see the areas that need the harder lines and the darker values, that's when you can go in and add those values darker. But you can see I have so many different layers of orange, the initial light layer that we had at the beginning, building up even some of those darker layers of the cad orange and the indigo, but now they're really soft. But all of them together look so nice and purposeful. We've got texture, we've got layers. But now I can go in and add darker contrast to really finish it off. And one of those areas is in the greenery on the red rocks as well. So if you'll remember that very initial layer we did, we tapped in some light green, wet into wet for future greenery on the rocks. And now we can go in with some darker green, focusing some of this contrasting color at the bottom of the greenery and to the left where there would be shadows, and it really makes even the lighter areas of green pop and come to life. I have switched to my size 4 round brush. This is a long round. I love long rounds. I love the tip. I love that it whips around and makes these really loose interesting strokes, and I don't have to think about it so much. I like that they are not too round of strokes, that I can feather the textures. It really is nice, especially for greenery or for lines in the rocks. So it was a perfect subject for using some of these brushes. And here I'm finishing off the greenery on the rocks by adding indigo in some of those shadow areas for a nice final bit of contrast. Then I felt like the red rocks were missing something, and I thought a purple shadow would be really nice. So there's a color on here that was permanent mauve, and it was perfect. I mixed it with cad orange just a bit to give it the dusty color that I wanted that made it feel like the rocks. And I glazed it over these shadowy areas because there's already so much texture and depth. We were able to just glaze it and create more interest while still seeing some of the textures and lines that we've made before shining through. And this is also the point in our rocks where you can have a little bit more fun. We have built up the layers, we have built up all of the different colors, and now we need to really hone in on the texture. Lines going horizontally, bigger lines, smaller lines, lines going vertically in some of these areas as well, making some of the edges at the top a little bit more rough, a little bit more shadowed, adding lines in places where we didn't necessarily have lines before, but we need some texture, and it can create the best texture doing these horizontal lines, especially on this kind of flatter rock formation that we've got going on in the center of the piece. And with these textures, we can play around with colors. And I just mixed together some of the yellows and reds and oranges to get an interesting red color to create lines and textures. Then you can mix that color in with some indigo to get some more of the shadow colors, and then create more lines either next to that reddish line you had before or in another place. It's the layering of the textures over and over that will give you that look that you want, because even here we have made this line and textures around that lower left side so many times, but now that we have built up the lines, it kind of looks layered, like the sediment in the red rocks, how it will have multiple lines, multiple layers, multiple values and colors, and that's what we're trying to build up at this point. So I'm using the very tip of my brush really lightly to create a lot of these lines so they look spontaneous. I'm not trying to think too much as I'm painting these lines. I just want to get them on the paper in a perfectly chaotic way. And so using the tip of your brush and letting this long tip, if you're using the long round 4, kind of flick across the paper to create the textures that you want is going to be your friend in making it look organic, but also look realistic. Now to work on some of the foliage again, I'm picking up my light cad yellow in a very bright light yellow wash. We want it to be really light, and I was thinking I need just more yellow in the entire greenery area. So you can pick up your yellow straight from the palette and glaze over some of these areas to create more of a yellow feeling, even in some of these darker green areas you've already painted. Now I've got some cad yellow deep, and I'm just doing the same thing between those two yellows. I'm glazing over some of the areas to give it more warmth and a yellow feeling. Picking up a darker wash that is already on my palette, it looks like this was the one that had the permanent mauve purpley color in it. I am defining some of the area on the left side of the path between where the ground goes up toward the foliage and the path, giving it a little bit more shadow so we can see where the path starts. I don't want it as defined as the right side since it is not in shadow. This should be where more of the light is hitting, so I'm keeping it really light and simple, but I just wanted to add some definition here before we continue on because I felt like it was a little bit lost. I also think adding color that goes farther back into our vanishing point, creating the perspective that the path is disappearing right at that very back left side corner, really helps to make it feel like we have the right perspective in this painting. I mixed together some vermilion with the Indian yellow color because I really wanted to glaze over our shadow on the right side of the path to bring some brightness and color back into it. And it's just amazing how bright and lively we made this shadow again. It's really fun to remember that you can glaze any color on top of another color with watercolor. Even if that color is dark, you can glaze a brighter color over it and completely change how that color feels. Taking the same color, maybe with a little bit more of the reds, I even added a little bit of pink. We're going to water it down so it's not too intense, so we can continue to glaze over some of those areas on the red rocks. Over some of the purple areas, the shadow areas, you can even tap into some of the lighter areas so that we get more of the overall red feeling in the rocks and it's not too brown or too gray. And I know I'm in my final stretch of the painting when everything is coming to life and the contrasting colors actually feel like they are standing out against the light areas. So with just a little bit more of that darker indigo purpley wash, I added some more contrast to the shadow area on the path, just on the right side, and then using that deeper indigo color with a little bit of the sap green added to it, we're going to tap in some more of that shadow just to finish everything off. This is our last step. One last bit of contrast in the greenery, in those shadow areas, in the greenery on the red rocks, maybe even take this color onto the red rocks in some spots as well, just to make sure we have that contrast, we have that pop of color that makes this painting feel like it's actually finished. Another trick I like to do is when I'm using this last bit of contrasting color, I will make the lines more flat and it feels like it is able to ground everything to the horizon when a lot of this more fluffy greenery is so round that I can make that contrast a really flat shape. And that is it. We have finished our desert scene. We use so many beautiful colors, but there are so many colors in the desert. I absolutely enjoyed using my Daler-Rowney Aquafine 48 pan studio set. Please let me know if you have any questions on how I created this below. I cannot wait to see your versions of this posted online, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye guys.